New Security Council (SC) report circulating in the Kremlin today detailing the activities of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation to remove from the entire economy all vestiges of the US dollar warns that the brewing storm in the US economy threatening to take down the entire Western economy is being met head-on by President Donald Trump, who is now poised to take total control of the US Federal Reserve he has previously vowed to abolish. An apocalyptic action America's most secretive and powerful multi-billionaire oligarchs have labeled the event and are rushing to prepare for, and who are joined by President Putin just ordering the longest bridge in human history to be built in order to protect Japan, and that no one in the world, especially in the U.S., should be surprised about as Trump, the very second he took his oath of office, had ordered installed right next to this White House Oval House desk a portrait of, not the first Republican Party President Abraham Lincoln, but the first Democratic Party President Andrew Jackson, whose words of hatred and contempt of central banks, like the Federal Reserve, still echo in the world today. According to this report, Andrew Jackson was the first self-made president of the United States who was not a member of any of the traditional elites that governed his nation, and who so incensed by these elites creating a central bank to rob the American people blind. In 1824, he ran to be the leader of his country, actually won, but then had these elites steal the presidency from him. 4 years later, in 1828, Andrew Jackson created his own political party, called the Democratic Party, ran again, and this time won, but upon whose election was set upon by that hero's deep state who pummeled him daily in newspapers calling him a traitor, and that against whom, on July 10, 1832, President Jackson spoke to the entire U.S. Congress telling them that he was abolishing his nation's central bank and warning, should the stock of the bank principally pass into the hands of the subjects of a foreign country, and we should unfortunately become involved in a war with that country, what would be our condition? Of the course which would be pursued by a bank almost wholly owned by the subjects of a foreign power, and managed by those whose interests, if not affections, would run in the same direction, there can be no doubt. All its operations within would be in aid of the hostile fleets and armies without. Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens in dependence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than the naval and military power of the enemy. With President Jackson further directly confronting these elite central bankers and their deep state allies and telling them, "Gentlemen, I have had men watching you for a long time and I am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You are a den of vipers and thieves." 81 years after President Jackson abolished the central bank in the United States, this report details, his words of warning had faded into obscurity, thus leading, on December 23, 1913, to a new central bank in America being created called the Federal Reserve, and whose actions during the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 saw them creating a scheme to bail out foreign banks and elite billionaires, with some estimates being over $16 trillion, while tens of millions of U.S. citizens and companies were crushed into total economic ruin, and that the highly respected Wall Street Journal described as, "The Fed is using what is termed a temporary U.S. dollar liquidity swap arrangement with the European Central Bank, ECB. There are similar arrangements with the central banks of Canada, England, Switzerland, and Japan. Simply put, the Fed trades or swaps dollars for euros. The Fed is compensated by payment of an interest rate, currently 50 basis points, or 0.5%, above the overnight index swap rate. The ECB, which guarantees to return the dollars at an exchange rate fixed at the time the original swap is made, then lends the dollars to European banks of its choosing. Why are the Fed and the ECB doing this? The Fed could, after all, lend directly to U.S. branches of foreign banks. It did a great deal of lending to foreign banks under various special credit facilities in the aftermath of Lehman's collapse in the fall of 2008. Or, the ECB could lend euros to banks and they could purchase dollars in foreign exchange markets. The world is, after all, awash in dollars. The two central banks are engaging in this roundabout procedure because each needs a fig leaf. The Fed was embarrassed by the revelations of its prior largesse with foreign banks. It does not want the debt of foreign banks on its books. A currency swap with the ECB is not technically a loan. This Federal Reserve wholesale economic rape of the American people in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 financial crises, this report explains, was completely covered up by the deep state and its political and mainstream propaganda media allies, but that couldn't be hidden from New York City real estate billionaire Donald Trump, whose over 50 years of experience in directly dealing with the intricacies of the Western banking system and the financing of his global construction projects made him uniquely suited to not only see what exactly was being done, but how to stop it from ever happening again. Having this knowledge of how the central bank Federal Reserve had destroyed the lives of tens of millions of his fellow American citizens for the benefit of foreign banks and elite billionaires, this report continues, Trump, like President Jackson had done over a century before him, ran an insurgent campaign for the U.S. presidency, with one of his main campaign messages being his vow to abolish the Federal Reserve, and whose exact blueprint for doing so was created by close Trump ally John A. Allison IV, who has long advocated for the abolishing of the Federal Reserve and returning the United States back to the gold standard, and whom Trump first considered making his Treasury Secretary, before deciding to place him in his shadow cabinet out of the reach of the deep state. Of the most important dates to note regarding President Trump's plan to abolish the Federal Reserve and return the United States back to the gold standard, this report says, was August 21, 2017, that aside from being the date of the solar eclipse that crossed the entirety of America, was, also, when Trump's Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and the powerful Republican Party leader of the U.S. Senate Mitch McConnell inspected the U.S. bullion depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky, to verify its exact gold holdings, and that spurred Russia and China to begin furiously buying gold as both knew what Trump was planning, and that today sees Russia having set an historic benchmark of having 2,000 tons of gold. To why Russia, as well as China, are ridding themselves of U.S. dollars and replacing them with gold as fast as possible, this report explains, is simple to understand when one realizes that the current price today of an ounce of gold is a little over $1,200, that in its essence is the manipulated paper cost of gold not reflecting its true value as it relates to its economic production costs, and whose true value is estimated to be over $25,000 an ounce. Some estimates saying $40,000 an ounce, and whose value, by 2022, some experts are now predicting will be over $65,000 an ounce. In order to best profit from when President Trump abolishes the Federal Reserve and returns the United States to the gold standard, this report notes, Russia and China have joined to create a real gold standard to further end U.S. dollar dominance, with China, the world's largest oil importing, consuming nation, this past March, rolling out its gold-backed petro-yuan. It will require its main traders to accept in purchases, and whose effects of some experts are predicting will crash the value of the U.S. dollar by as much as 90%. With even Hillary Clinton billionaire supporter Mark Lasry warning of the chaos that will erupt in the global financial markets should the Democrats regain control of the U.S. Congress, this report further notes. The American people are still being kept from the truth that the Clinton regime has brought their nation to the brink of financial catastrophe and who, in the 1990s, set in motion their nation's greatest crisis when, 1. They repealed Glass-Steagall allowing banks to go nuts and return to proprietary trading of the 1920s that led to the Great Depression, and, 2. They gave the banks absolute dominion over students by removing their right to declare bankruptcy on what they owe the bankers. The main reason behind these insane actions of national economic suicide perpetrated against the American people by the Clinton regime, and continued onwards by the Obama regime, this report explains, was to create a fiscal environment in the United States where everyone would be crying to their federal government to come save them, and whose success is measured by an already dismal U.S. government fiscal forecast that just got 106% worse, that's now being pushed towards outright oblivion by the public employee pension crisis for state governments that has deepened to catastrophic record levels, but whose U.S. student loan department slave young peoples can't help to alleviate, as 2/3 of them between the ages of 18 to 37 have absolutely no money to save. With new polls shockingly showing that nearly half of these Clinton regime-created American college students and graduate debt slaves now prefer communist socialism to capitalism, this report continues. President Trump is left with little time to abolish the Federal Reserve to free them from the deliberate economic tyranny they are living under, and that Trump is now poised to do by taking over the entire board of governors of the Federal Reserve, whom he plans to destroy from within. To the actual date that President Trump will unleash his full wrath and destroy the Federal Reserve, though, this report notes, will be at the start of 2020 when the International Maritime Organization, IMO, begins its enforcement of a new regulation that will push oil to $200 and initiate a global economic crash of horrible proportions, and involves the total elimination of heavy diesel fuels that as many as half of world refineries cannot produce a replacement for, and whose grave consequences have been described as economic activity will slow and, in some places, grind to a halt. Food costs will climb as farmers, unable to pay for fuel, reduce plantings. Deliveries of goods and materials to factories and stores will slow or stop. Vehicle sales will plummet, especially those of gas-guzzling sport utility vehicles, SUVs. One or more major U.S. automakers will face bankruptcy, even closure. Housing foreclosures will surge in the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world. Millions will join the ranks of the unemployed as they did in 2008. Unbeknownst to the totally unsuspecting American people about what this 2020 shock will be bringing to them, this report explains, is that it has long been planned by their own Democratic Party and anti-Trump Republican Party globalist factions, who in the total economic chaos that will descend upon the United States, intended to use it to establish full and complete dictatorial control so that they could establish their communist socialist government in the mold of China and the European Union, but whose master plan to do this, of course, unexpectedly ran headlong into a force more powerful than them named President Donald Trump, whose plans to abolish the Federal Reserve, and then use America's vast gold holdings to pay off every one of his citizens' debts, now sees the U.S. embroiled in its greatest crisis in history. In order to protect the Russian Federation from this existential war for control over the United States playing itself out to death between President Trump and his deep state globalist enemies, this report continues, President Putin has ordered an additional 70 military units deployed on the Western Front against NATO, with his further ordering the immediate construction of human history's longest bridge, that will be 580 kilometers, 360 miles, long with railroad links and other infrastructure connecting the Russian mainland to Sakhalin Island, and whose ultimate goal will be to building a bridge connecting Japan's Hokkaido to the south of Sakhalin Island, that with these two bridges would make Japan a continental state, that will, and hopefully, save the Japanese peoples who are now warned are nearing extinction. Rather than being like the Russian Federation, its leaders, and its peoples, and President Trump, too, seeking to find ways to survive this coming apocalypse, this report concludes, Dr. Douglas Rushkoff, professor of media theory and digital economics at the City University of New York, Queens College, who coined the terms viral media, digital native, and social currency, has just reported that he was summoned to Silicon Valley, and paid half his yearly salary